Hi, my name is Bhagwan Chowdhry. I am a professor of finance at ISB, the Indian School of Business. Today, I'll be speaking with Professor Deepa Mani. Professor Mani went to St. Stephen's in Delhi and then to Carnegie Mellon for her master's, and she got her PhD at University of Texas, Austin. She's been at ISB for the last 10 years or so. She's an expert in technology and information science. So today's topic is the coronavirus and the nature of work. Everywhere we look, there's a lockdown. We're being told, stay at home, work from home. I wanted to ask Deepa, this is something you have thought about a lot, the nature of work. Work from home. Is this going to work?
I think a couple of points in response. First, I don't think work from home is a fundamentally new concept. I think it's been around for a while. However, it's largely been limited, perhaps, to select individuals who've self-selected this way of work for themselves.
And also maybe certain kinds of industries.
Correct. Or organizations with certain kinds of capabilities, right? So certain organizations who can afford the constraints that come with this and who can perhaps afford the capabilities that this requires have typically selected it in the past. And I think now, however, what we are witnessing is fundamentally more systematic, it's more pervasive, and it's clearly, ubiquitous in the sense that governments...
People are thinking about it more generally.
Correct.
So the reason you say it's been around is, we know in the tech industry, they tried this, but even there wasn't an agreement. Like Yahoo, for instance, turned their mind and said, no, we want you to come back and work at office.
Correct.
And other people said it's okay to work from home.
Correct.
What are the lessons we had learned from that?
So if you keep in mind that, this was a self-selected sample of individuals and organizations, then it's difficult to draw inferences from the study of these self-selected samples and conclude anything with rigor.
You can't
right?
generalize.
Exactly.
It's too small.
Exactly. So, and therefore what you also find is therefore mixed evidence that it improves productivity, maybe it doesn't improve productivity. It's a distraction. No, people work longer. No, they work shorter hours. No, there is heterogeneity around different groups of people. It works for this industry. It doesn't work. So I think now, however, Bhagwan, what I was saying was that now, given that the government is, ordering people into self-quarantine. It's ordering people, be it staggered in a staggered manner or at large. This is now being enforced at large.
Okay.
And
so this will force us to actually think carefully in a systematic way.
Correct.
Okay.
About a phenomenon that is getting more systematic and pervasive.
Okay.
And which is in contrast to the earlier regimes of work from home, is imposed. And therefore now we perhaps will have a better understanding of what are the implications and, at large and generalizable.
Now, you did a study at SRITNI. That SRITNI is the center that you are director of. It wasn't quite this, but related to this. Can you tell us a little about that study?
Yes. So let me in the light of this this new practice of work or patterns of work, I think what organizations will have to grapple with is what can be done at home.
Okay.
Right? What kind of work can be done at home? How can we enable this work to be done at home? And what are some of the policies and practices that we must effect for this work to happen effectively or efficiently at home? And the work that we're doing at SRITNI is twofold. There's one, which is, so Professor Shekhar and I are looking at a work from home index and also an index that estimates the human proximity of a job as well as the ability of the job to be done at home, and in turn giving a disruptability index for every occupation. We've essentially taken the list of all occupations in India And these occupations can, of course, be mapped to sectors and to districts.
Okay.
And
So this is a longer study, and I think you're going to talk to Professor Shekhar about it in more
But a
detail.
complementary.
But it's essentially the index is talking about to what extent certain kind of job could be restructured.
Correct.
And to what extent it cannot be.
Correct.
And you're looking at across different sectors and different type of people.
Correct. What occupations are amenable to this new form of arrangement, and also how can these be enabled? So we're also running a survey of organizations to try and actually the surveys of individuals who have affected this in recent times to understand what are the challenges they face. Are there policies that they are encountering? What are some of the practices that their organizations have effected to support them? And what are some of the psychological responses, that they are encountering?
So let me break it down a little bit. I think there are three things you're mentioning. One is to what extent we'll have to relearn this thing, because now we are being forced to look at it. And you don't think that this is a temporary phenomenon. You think that even after COVID is over, the changes that are going to happen are going to be permanent. Are you saying that?
I think these are interesting times, and it's not unprecedented that technology alters consumer behavior. Right? You see it with the iPhone, you see it with apps, right? We used to use browsers, then the app comes along, and now we have a new behavior which completely substitutes the older one. You have conversational search, which did not exist, and these are not behaviors that were existing in the market. The technology companies went out and said, hey, what do you want? And we'll build something to suit it. This was the other way around, where technology introduced innovations that brought out latent behaviors or latent consumer behaviors. So those are interesting. So now I think if you look at, for instance, how tech companies are responding to this phenomenon, Byju's, for instance, has said, it's given free access to all of its educational
Byju
content.
is that educational app there. Correct. You can learn at home.
Correct.
Correct. So they made it free.
They made it free till April, and they've seen like a 60% increase in traffic. You look at, for instance, telemedicine.
It's kind of like what happened with demonetization. Suddenly people got Paytm.
Yes.
So it's a very similar phenomenon.
Yes. Or the federal government has essentially told doctors that they can use chatbots, they can use symptom checkers, telemedicine, virtual consults to try and identify which the high-risk population that must be brought into hospitals vis-a-vis stay at home through virtual consults, right? So these are, I think,
and this has actually a great potential, because telemedicine in a country like India can make big differences whether or not we had a corona crisis.
Correct. And if you think about what's been the impediment, a large part of it has also been buyer behavior, consumer behavior. So if in the time of crisis, the tech companies are able to affect behaviors at large, right? For instance, you become comfortable. Coursera is doing this, for its Coursera for Campus solution, accessible to all universities that are impacted through this phenomenon. So if you're able to do, or if these tech companies are able to affect changes in consumer behavior at large, I think it's going to be very interesting, right? Because then this is not going to be a switch back to the old way of working.
So
you're going to see
in some sense, shift. Because we are being forced to do it, there might be enough investment into both technologies. So Malcolm Gladwell talks about the tipping point. It might push us in the other direction, where we put enough technology in place. But I think you also mentioned something else, that it's not just about technology. You need to change the nature of work itself.
Correct.
There are governance policies you mentioned. Can you say something about that? Companies will have to think. It's not just about having screens and video conferencing.
No, it's not. I think the technology, keep in mind that I think that, if you look at it from the perspective of incumbent companies, universities like ours, or the traditional healthcare providers which are countering telemedicine, traditional educational providers like us who are countering online learning, so to speak. I think for us the shift is not just in terms of investment in technology infrastructure, but also in terms of processes, practices, and policies.
Processes, practice, and policies. Okay.
Correct, which will enable
You must be a
the
business
shift.
school professor. The 3 Ps right there. Okay, very good.
Yes, but the shift in all of these, which will allow for this behavior to, or which will allow institutions or incumbent institutions to embrace this behavior and respond to it. Because I think, in some sense, like you said, it's not just about more investments in technology, reward systems, incentives.
Reward system. So tell us something about that, because if I'm working from home, nobody knows if I'm working 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours. So you cannot measure input.
And maybe you shouldn't, right?
Or maybe you should not.
Yeah,
so
and maybe you shouldn't.
We'll switch from input to
output-based metrics.
Output-based measures.
Correct. So that's an example of something like that. And then at the same time, how do you create these collaborative systems that exist in the traditional world to allow you to be able to work more effectively? Which brings me back to my first point, which was on, we'll have to think very carefully about which are the jobs that can be done at home.
Yes.
And what are the complementary investments that need to be effected for these jobs to be done effectively at home.
Excellent. Now, can I bring one more P in there? You referred to it a little bit, which is, you also said that the whole psychological viewpoint needs to change. Can you say something? That's the 4th P.
Yeah, there was a recent Science article which came out a few days ago about how, work from home can also be isolating.
Isolating.
Correct. It can be...
I've heard from a lot of women, they like to go to work because it gives them the freedom to be away from home and not be with children and household chores, which women have to do a disproportionate amount of.
And I'm sure there's an equally liberating narrative for the men as well. But, so I'm sure, between those, there are reasons why, you identify with the organization. And you have an identity that is not just your individual identity, but your work also brings with you an identity that's attached to your organization and that you derive from. So and there are many subcomponents to it, right? There is the identity that you derive from being part of a team, from being part of a project, and being part of a larger department, the organization, so have you. So I think
it's like when you get introduced, people say, "What's your name?" And the next question is, "So what do you do?
Right.
Where do you work?"
Right.
And if say, "I work at home," it's not as powerful as saying, "I work for IBM."
Correct. And that's the branding aspect of it, but also, there is clearly intangible benefits that you derive from affiliation with all of these different structures within the organization, which are rewarding and enriching psychologically, to your question.
So academics feel like these changes, these big changes, because it allows us to study. And I want you to say one more thing. That's not a P, but you use a word which is disruptability.
Correct.
Can you say something about that?
Well, in the context of the specific index that we're looking at, we find that there are occupations that are amenable to working from home. There are occupations...
For example?
So, for instance, a large class of managers across sectors, doing administrative work, clerical work, that can be done from home. Yeah. So here's an example of an occupation that can be done from home. Vis-a-vis nursing or painters or miners, right? There's a physical component to it which requires these occupations to be present in the workspace. So here are examples. These are two extreme solutions, right? For on that spectrum, and there's also in some sense and that's one dimension. The other dimension is also, what do you need to be proximate to a human being to do your work?
Do I need to work together with another person?
Correct. So both of those together, I think, will determine the disruptability of that occupation. We call it disruptability because, in some sense, if you had to just enforce a uniform lockdown, which unfortunately, we find ourselves in the midst of. There's going to be greater effect on certain occupations vis-a-vis others.
Right.
And it's useful for both policymakers as well as organizations affecting those shutdowns
To be
try and
sensitive to that.
understand
Yes.
what this is and at least be aware of the impacts of this so that they can effect the right measures to do this.
So since this is part of our 3 tips series, if I can summarize, I think you're saying 3 things. One is, it's too bad that we have ourselves in this situation.
It's very unfortunate, yes.
Very unfortunate. But given that we are in this situation, this will allow us to make changes that were not possible because those are only incremental. This may allow us to experiment with things that are going to be bigger. So even when we come out of it, some of the changes are going to be permanent.
Correct.
And the second thing you said is organizations have to change both the nature of work, the technology, which includes policy, procedures, and the third P was?
Practices.
Practices. And the last thing you said was the whole psychological nature of how we think about these things.
I got another P, I think, so which is, also that I think there is this, I think in these times, there's also a need.
Now you'll be competing with marketing because they have 5 Ps, okay? What's the 5th P?
Which I think is also about partnering with the, this has to be seen as a partnership with the employee. I think these, especially in times like these, it's important for organizations to try and understand how that partnership will be defined and affected.
So in fact, the organization may not be limited.
To improve the 6th P, performance. Sorry.
Performance, okay, right. Performance, okay. I think we got 6 now.
Let's stop,
so maybe we should stop here. Yeah. And Shekhar and Deepa are going to be talking more about how they actually measure these things and what are the insights from different industries and different occupations. So please join in for that next episode. Thank you very much for watching.